Hello, Waffle lovers, and welcome to another episode of Whatever Flips Your Waffle here on 365sportscast.com. I'm your host, Mark Domeyer, coming to you, as always, from the bunker deep in the heart of southern Minnesota. We've skipped right over spring here and gone directly to summer with temperatures in the 80s this week. I'm glad you've decided to tune in and listen to me talk about Minnesota sports. Welcome to those of you who tune in each and every week on Wednesday evenings, and welcome to those of you checking things out for the first time. I hope you'll enjoy the experience. We're going to get to our interview this week in just a moment. Sit back, relax, prepare yourself for another helping of waffles, syrup optional. This week I talked to Lucas Seehafer, who writes about the Lynx and the Twins. We talk about physical ailments of some of our favorite athletes, and so we're going to get right to that right now. Joining the program this week is Lucas Seehafer. I was familiar with Lucas's work. He was writing for the Owatonna People's Press, writing the sports section and everything. He's moved on to some other things. He still does some sports writing for Twins Daily and for The Next. And he also does some physical therapy. He's an adjunct professor dealing with some things in the exercise science and physical therapy world. Lucas, welcome to the program.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, why don't you explain to listeners a little bit just kind of how these things intersect, the journey you've taken as both a writer and also physical therapy?
Yeah, so it's kind of been a bit of a circuitous route, or maybe that's not the right word, but basically I when I was in grad school during my first year, I knew that I needed some sort of outlet to kind of burn off steam during my times when I wasn't studying. And I started my own blog about the Minnesota Timberwolves at the time, who were, probably one of the worst teams in franchise history, which is really saying something.
Right, yeah.
Yeah, and then, just kind of one thing led to another. The right people got eyeballs on my work and recruited me to write for a couple different places, most notably Canis Hoopus, which is affiliated with SB Nation. And then eventually A Wolf Among Wolves, which was an independent blog that used to be affiliated with ESPN back during their True Hoop days. And then started writing about basketball, started incorporating some of the stuff I was learning in PT school and the injury analysis, that kind of stuff. One thing led to another. And all of a sudden here I am 6-7 years later, still writing about sports and still doing physical therapy.
That's very cool. You can find Lucas on Twitter. As I said, I kind of knew him from his days at the Owatonna paper and followed him onto Twitter and stuff. And again, Twins Daily, we've had, I always mispronounce his last name too, Ted Schwartzler on the program before. And so it's a fantastic place to get a lot of information. I get my email every day and look at a lot of the stories and have a good time there. Well, let's talk about this physical therapy thing, and you talk about that, bring that up. There's a lot of injury news all the time, and if you're a sports fan, you follow all that. And some things become really obvious and easy. Carlos Correa gets hit in the hand twice in one game and breaks a finger, and he's going to be on the shelf for a while. But some of the other things seem like they become very, very cautious with these professional athletes. Is there such a thing as being too cautious when it comes to these high-level athletes?
Yeah, so I think there's a couple things going on in your question there. First and foremost is that what's kind of reported out to us, whether that's through team press releases or beat writers who maybe don't have a ton of medical knowledge. That's not necessarily their job. Their job is to get the information out there. And what is often relayed is not kind of the whole picture. Like you find out that the example is this thing that's going on with Ben Simmons in the NBA. The team is particularly vague at releasing information, which leads to speculation, which leads to people kind of guessing at how things are going more than having kind of knowledgeable opinions about them. Now, other teams are better at that than others. The Twins are usually fairly transparent about what's going on. Same with the Timberwolves. The Lynx, like we're pretty lucky here in the state of Minnesota that the teams are about as transparent as you can ask for.
Right.
So when it comes to, is it such thing as being too cautious? I'll say I'm going to say no, and here's why. I think most people that are working with professional athletes are some of the most highly trained and knowledgeable people in their profession. And they're working with these athletes, on a daily, hourly basis. So they kind of have an intricate knowledge of, what they were like before their injury, what they're like now, how their progression is going, that kind of stuff. So like when people like me or other people who have medical knowledge that come out on Twitter and say, hey, this injury usually takes, X amount of weeks to get better, that's kind of the general timeline. I always try to portray like, hey, this is the general timeline, but you can have, plus or minus 2 weeks, on any given side of that. Most teams tend to, if anything, go longer because the research has showed that, the best indicator for future injury is past injury.
Right.
So you want to make sure your athlete is as good as possible before they go back, so they limit that risk of getting re-injured or injuring something else.
Yeah, I mean the basics. I've always told young people when I coached and everything else that as soon as you sprain your ankle, it's that much easier to sprain your ankle again in the future.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yep. And it has to do with how the injury healed. The new tissue that gets laid down for the old injured tissue isn't as strong. Maybe it's a body mechanics issue. There's a whole bunch of different factors, and that's another thing I try to get across in my analysis is that it rarely. You can point to Carlos Correa and you can say that's why he injured his finger because he got hit with a 90-mile-an-hour fastball right on the finger.
Right.
But for most injuries, you can't necessarily do that. They're very multifactorial, which then complicates the recovery process. So I guess, can teams be too cautious? Rarely. But for the most part, they have a good idea of what they're doing.
Right. I mean, I see people, and I should stay off of some social media sometimes, but as soon as Byron Buxton sits out a game because he's feeling a little tender somewhere, people freak out. But when you're talking about past injuries, and Buxton's a guy who's had a number of injuries, and you're paying him a lot of money to be the best player on the team, people want him out there. But if he's going to play through something and get more hurt, like Miguel Sano, that's a bigger problem, right?
Exactly. And you look at a person like Buxton who he has a very significant injury history, but if you look at each of his injuries, they're more or less isolated events. Like, when he was younger, he broke a finger sliding into second base, and then he tore his labrum in his shoulder crashing into the outfield wall, and then he got hit on the hand and broke his hand that way. Hip flexor strain. This most recent stuff that happened just kind of slid awkwardly into second base. So you can't necessarily point at each of those injuries and say, hey, they're related to each other.
Right.
So in one sense, it can, it's frustrating for all parties involved. It's frustrating for fans. It's definitely frustrating for Buxton. It's frustrating for the Twins because you look at all these injuries and say, hey, these are isolated events. How could we have prevented most of these things? And the fact of the matter is they probably couldn't. Right.
Just unlucky in a lot of cases.
Right, exactly. It'd be one thing if you kept spraining the ankle over and over and over again, and the athlete wasn't doing the proper steps in the rehab process, that kind of stuff. But that's just not the case with Buxton, and for the most part, that's not the case with most athletes. So
right.
It's it's a very complex things, injuries that we often tend to boil down into the simplest forms.
So the ones who maybe try to rush back, and you had mentioned, if you don't let it heal properly. And I think back to, I've been out of high school for 30 years, and things were done much differently back there. You would turn your ankle, and you would sit out for a little bit, put a little ice on it, and get back in the game. Probably not the best idea.
Yeah, probably not. And with today's day and age, a lot of things kind of work on a pendulum. Right? There's back in the day we were maybe too not cautious enough when it comes to injuries, and then we come today where there's a lot of rest days, planned rest days, load management is the term that's
right.
coined.
Yep.
And I think there's a lot of good science behind some of that load management, and there's a lot of good thought process behind it to show that it is effective. But then there's also, I think, a misunderstanding of kind of its overall what's the word I'm looking for? Application, maybe. Basically, like, you load manage, and you see this quite a bit in the NBA where players get days off because of rest or whatever.
Yep.
load managing for one specific player may or may not prevent that player from getting injured. But when you look at like the data across the entire league, load management can lead to potentially lower injuries league-wide. So on an individual basis, maybe load management only can do so much to prevent injuries. But when you look at, instead of one player, you look at, whatever 30 times 15 is, about 450 players. And you see injuries go down because of load management. So as much progress as we've made in kind of determining how to best handle these athletes and how to get them back, at their strongest so that they can prevent their injuries, we have made a whole lot of progress, but there is still some progress yet to go.
Right. There'll always be room for improvement. Is there it seems like a weird question, but is there such a thing as being too in shape? Like you are at such a finely tuned point that it becomes easier to get injured because your muscles are so specialized into what you need for that particular sport?
Yeah, so if you look at the research, there's a good amount of research out there, particularly in high school athletes, and they find that the people who don't specialize in sports, the athletes who don't specialize in sports, so that play, they still play sports year round, but instead of just playing basketball, they also run track, or they also play football, or they also play soccer, or whatever. Those athletes are far less likely to get injured and far more likely to earn like college scholarships and that kind of stuff than the people that specialize. So in that sense, yes, if you're just putting your body through the same motions and doing the same thing and doing it all year round and not having any time to stop, there is quite a bit of evidence that does increase your risk for injury. Now I think, kind of a more specific example, I think we can go back to Byron Buxton actually for this one. Go back to when it was, I forget if it was his like second year or third year or something like that. Slid into second base, broke his finger. Okay, that's not something that's necessarily uncommon among baseball players, but if you look at what Buxton it was like then, he's still incredibly fast, but he was faster back then. Well, anytime you move faster, you're going to have more momentum build up, and anytime you have more momentum build up, it's more difficult to stop. That's just simple physics.
Yep.
So what the Twins tried to have Buxton do over the last couple of off seasons to maybe prevent some of those types of injuries is to put on more muscle mass. Yes, that might slow down his overall speed, but it'll provide kind of more cushioning, I guess, for lack of a better term.
Okay.
For some of those injuries, like crashing into the wall. If he had more muscle bulk, would he have torn his labrum? There's no one will be able to say whether or not that's the case, but the Twins' philosophy was maybe if he had more muscle mass, more padding, his body would be able to take hits better, and he'd be less susceptible to injury. On that end of the spectrum, it's a little bit more unknown. It's one of those things where, that logically from an exercise science and medical background, there's some solid theory in that theory, but whether or not it's actually effective, we just don't have a whole bunch of good data on it at the moment.
Yeah. Well, I just always think we never used to hear about ACL injuries in high school, and now it seems like all the time. And I've seen enough kids and I've seen enough happen right in front of me, and I sometimes look and I think, some of these people are ones who they might play more than one sport, but they're also playing more than one sport at a time, and sometimes that wear and tear as well. But yeah, I mean, if you're playing volleyball year round and you're doing that jumping repeatedly, or you're playing basketball year round, it seems like that's going to get the better of you in the long run.
Exactly. Yep. And that's the other thing. If you're doing too much, there's a lot of what we know in rehab science and injury prevention is not, very solid just because it's difficult to run kind of gold standard research studies. But what we do have a pretty good grasp on is the people that go, from relatively no activity to relatively a lot of activity. They're the ones that get injured, and the ones that do a lot of activity and don't give their body enough time to recover and kind of relax, they're also the ones that get injured most frequently.
Right.
So that can be kind of the difficult thing, especially when you're in high school and you're thinking you maybe want to play at the next level, trying to get a scholarship or show off, for coaches to get their attention. You think you have to be competing, in AAU basketball every weekend and then playing baseball 3 days a week during the summer. And then there's also those football camps that you have to get to. All of that can have an additive effect and can lead to injuries. So finding the right balance between doing all those things and still leaving time for rest or recovery and being a kid is super important as well.
Yeah. We're here with Lucas Seehafer. He does some writing for Twins Daily for the Next. He does some physical therapy. So we've been talking about injuries and how to deal with them and some of the things that happen in sports. And that leads to a somewhat connected and yet distant topic. The Minnesota Lynx are firing up their season. And as you and I are talking, it's game day. It's the first day of the WNBA season, even though the program here won't air for a few more days. But it's an interesting year for the Minnesota Lynx, who, let's face it, have been probably the best professional sports team in the state of Minnesota. The only team that brings championships since 1991.
Yeah, they're most successful franchise definitely in recent memory in Minnesota. Dominant, top of the standings most years of the WNBA. And yeah, like you said, this season, this summer is going to be pretty interesting with Sylvia Fowles, multi-time champion, former MVP, reigning Defensive Player of the Year. This will be her last season. And then Napheesa Collier, the team's arguably second best player, who just recently signed an extension and will be kind of the face of the franchise moving forward. She's going to be out for most, if not all, of the summer, as she's going to be expecting her first child here in the next month or so. So, it'll be interesting to see kind of how things play out and how the season goes this year. Where
does Sylvia Fowles rank in the WNBA history? I mean, she's fantastic.
Yeah, she's definitely a Hall of Famer. I think that's no doubt. As far as where she lines up in all-time greats, it's tough to compare to her to say someone like a Diana Taurasi or a Sue Bird, because they play different positions, have different roles on the team. But when you look at bigs, front court players, she's one of the best of all time. She's been walking double-double more or less since her first season in the WNBA. Spent her first handful of years with the Chicago Sky, where she was kind of recognized as a really solid player, and then really took off when she joined the Lynx. Like I said, winning MVP. I think she's Maya Moore is probably a future Hall of Famer as well. She hasn't played in a handful of years. Lindsay Whalen was just inducted this past winter, and that announced she was going to be part of the next Hall of Fame class. I think give it a number of years after Syl retires, and she'll be right up there with Whalen as a NBA or as a WNBA Hall of Famer.
And it's sometimes very nice. Hey, this is the last go around, and there's some extra motivation maybe for her teammates. Not that there's never enough motivation to try to win a championship, but you want to go out on a winning note. Does it feel like in recent years, like Fowles could continue to play at a high level, or is she going out at the right time while she's still kind of at the top of her game, but maybe seeing some receding?
Yeah, it is interesting. So during the 2020 pandemic season, she missed a bulk of the season with a calf injury, and that was one of the first times in her career where she kind of had a muscle injury that caused her to miss most of the season. And then last year she comes back and she was back to her old self, winning Defensive Player of the Year. On the defensive end of the court, she's still as dominant as she's ever been. She could play probably another 5-6 years and still be very, very dominant defensively, just because of her stature. She's 6'6". If you've ever seen her in person, you can tell that she doesn't have an ounce of body fat on her. She's just one of those players that that when you are driving in the paint, you don't want to go up against her because she's going to block your shot or alter it or whatever. Offensively, she's maybe taken a little bit of a step back just because she is such a focus on the block. She doesn't really have an outside game. But that being said, she still averaged a double-double last year. I think she'll average a double-double this season as long as she stays healthy. If she really wanted to, she could probably play another 2-3 years and still be one of the best players in the WNBA. But she had mentioned towards the end of last season, when she was thinking about potentially retiring, how she had other interests that she wanted to get into. After she retires from the WNBA, she wants to go back to grad school and get a degree in mortuary science, for instance, because she really loves that field and has had a passion for that really for her whole life. So she even said that if the whole basketball thing didn't work out, she was going to do that way back in the day too. So she also talked about potentially wanting to start a family at some point, and being in her mid-30s, she thought time was maybe kind of running out on that opportunity. So, I think in terms of skills, she still has a lot more in the tank, but in terms of other interests, I think she thinks this is the right time to go out. And it's hard to argue with a person who's motivated and thinks their time is up. Yeah,
and again, there's something to be said about going out while you have game and you're not watching them kind of fritter away. It's interesting. Maybe if I have a sister who's a mortician. Perhaps she'll encounter Sylvia if she decides to go that route and do that. You mentioned I lost the name, Collier, who's having a baby. It's a tough spot to be in as a professional female athlete. Like, you want to start a family, and at the same time, being a professional athlete is very difficult when you're wanting to have a family and raise your children and everything else too.
Yeah, exactly. And this happens, probably most years there's somebody who misses some time due to pregnancy. Odyssey Sims, who actually recently re-signed with the Lynx, who was a member of the Lynx in 2019 and 2020. She missed a good chunk of the 2020 season because of she had a child. She was able to come back and play half the season, and Nafisa on her media call the other day talking about her extension, she had mentioned that she was going to do everything in her power to get back. Right. But like you said, it's a huge sacrifice for the athlete, for their team, and the WNBA, for who I think does most things pretty well. One of the things that kind of puts everybody in a bind in that situation is that WNBA has some unique contract rules. And one of the rules is that if a player misses time due to pregnancy, you can't suspend their contract and get salary relief. So you can suspend contracts for other reasons and get salary relief so that the team can sign a different player and have a full roster. But for pregnancy, that isn't allowed in the current collective bargaining agreement. So when Cheryl Reeve says, hey, the Lynx are going to start the season with 11 players on the roster, that includes Collier, who probably won't play at all. So really the Lynx are going to be starting the season with 10. And they currently have one player, Kayla McBride, who's still playing over in Europe and won't probably come back stateside until the beginning of June. They have another player, another couple of players actually, who are currently hurt and recovering from injuries. So really, heading into, it would be Friday night's regular season game, they would only have 8 active players on the roster available to suit up. Wow. So in that instance, the WNBA has some rules in which you can kind of exceed the salary cap and go sign a couple of players. The Lynx signed a couple, so they'll be up to 10, and they'll have a full squad come tonight's game. But it's interesting how the WNBA operates in that kind of instance compared to the NBA, when you have 15 players on a roster. And you can exceed the salary cap if you're saying, like, re-signing a player that was already on your team and so on and so forth. In the WNBA, they have what's called a hard salary cap, so you cannot exceed that under any circumstance unless given this exception to the league if you don't have enough players on your roster. Okay. And rosters are only 12 players instead of 15 players. So it creates really some unique circumstances for teams as they're trying to figure out how to construct their roster. Right. Interesting. Yeah. So this is a team that, you talked a little bit earlier about load management and stuff. This is a more compressed season this year because of some fall championship stuff occurring. And so managing injuries, I'm going to say the name wrong, McCoutry has a sore knee she's dealing with. Cheryl Reeve has her work cut out for her here because you have all these games in a much tighter time frame. Exactly, yeah. And McContry, she's coming off. So she played the 2020 season, no problem. But she tore her left ACL in 2019 and her right ACL in 2021. So she's, had missed 2 of the last 3 seasons because of knee injuries. And now she's going to be missing the season opener because of knee soreness. In what was kind of a surprise, the Lynx cut who was expected to be their starting point guard, Leja Clarendon, because they are still recovering from a stress fracture in their right lower leg. And Cheryl Reeve didn't think that they were going to be ready and available for enough throughout the season to basically justify keeping them on the contract or on the roster. So yeah, she has lots of tough decisions. She did have lots of tough decisions to pare the roster down to the opening day roster, and it's probably only going to continue as the regular season goes by, or at least until, say, Kayla McBride comes back from overseas, Damiris Dantas comes back from her foot injury. It's a juggling act that I think is probably keeping her up at night at times.
Yeah, and there's no doubt Cheryl Reeve has been a fantastic coach. I don't think you can question the job that she's done, but this is definitely going to be a real challenge for her. Where do the Lynx land this season realistically? Can they contend for a title?
Yeah, so I think it'll be interesting. So I think they have some of the best top-end talent in the league, right? So Sylvia Fowles, I think she'll be right up there for Defensive Player of the Year. If things go right, she could probably still contend for an MVP. Kayla McBride, while maybe not a superstar, is all-star caliber, one of the better shooting guards in the WNBA. And when she's going right, she can be could be the best player on the court on any given night. But when you look at the team as a whole, right now they're kind of lacking maybe some overall talent or some consistency at the point guard position, which is super important in the WNBA, just like it's important in the NBA. They don't necessarily have the deepest roster. Some of their players at the end of the bench don't have a ton of WNBA experience, or you have the likes of McContry, who in her prime was one of the best players in the league, but now is just unsure of what she's going to be because of how much time she's missed over the last handful of seasons. I think they have the personnel to have probably a top maybe 4 or 5 defense, and the offense is a little bit more up in the air. It'll be kind of interesting to see how that grows and develops as the season goes on. But I think can they compete for the playoffs? I think they'll absolutely make the playoffs. There's 12 teams in the WNBA. Top 8 teams make the playoffs. I think they're definitely pretty solidly within that top 8. The real question will be, will they compete for home court advantage, or are they going to be one of the lower seeds? I think as things stand right now, they're probably closer to 6, 7, or 8 than they are 1, 2, or 3.
Okay, all right. Back during the pandemic and all these things were in a bubble and everything, the WNBA was, I think, the only league that actually showed growth in its television ratings. People were tuning in, they were watching that compared to other professional sports. Is it time to capitalize on that? Is it time for the WNBA to expand? Or, is there enough talent out there to make that case?
Yeah, so I think Cheryl Reeve has said this. Most of the players have said this. The player union has said this. Basically, the only person that hasn't said this, maybe perhaps frustratingly, is Kathy Engelbert, the commissioner. But as things stand right now, there is a lot of WNBA talent that is having trouble holding on to WNBA jobs. So there's 12 teams, and you can only carry 12 players on a roster. So at max, there's 144 jobs available in the WNBA, and there are more than 144 WNBA caliber players.
Yes.
You look at, like the Lynx cut Crystal Dangerfield recently, who was the 2020 Rookie of the Year. Granted, she struggled last year, but you'd never see something like that in the NBA where a player won Rookie of the Year and then was no longer on their team 3 years later.
Right.
Renaya Davis, the team's 2021 first-round draft pick. She was cut. She didn't play at all last year because she had an injured foot. and was cut after having a pretty strong overseas season this past winter, and then a pretty strong preseason as well. So I think, expansion is absolutely should be on the table. And as far as how many teams should be expanded to, I think you could justify 2 or 3 cities, bring the total up to 15. I think you could easily do that and still field quality, competitive teams. And like you said, the WNBA is growing, and women's basketball in general is growing year after year in terms of TV ratings and income being brought in. The league brings in millions and millions and millions of dollars each year. And if you look at the highest salaries in the WNBA, I think the highest paid player this summer is like $260,000, $270,000, something like that. You look at that compared to the NBA. Granted, the NBA has been around for 50 years longer, but you look at the NBA and the highest paid players are, making 10, 20 times that amount.
Yeah.
So I think expansion should be on the table. If it's not, then I think the WNBA would be better because of it.
Yeah, and these women's players are almost forced to go play overseas. They make more money over there. And of course that leads to some other things like Brittany Griner's in a difficult situation now over in Russia, and that's got to be tough, not knowing what's happening there too with her.
Yeah, exactly. When she was first detained, there wasn't a whole lot of information being provided on what was going on. What many media members kind of around the United States and players around the United States were being told was kind of keep things quiet, keep it on the down low for now until things get figured out as to what's going on. And then recently the WNBA came out and said that they had evidence to suspect that her being arrested she was falsely arrested and is being held prisoner falsely. And things are obviously pretty tender over there in Russia right now with the war in Ukraine going on. So, it's unfortunate that, players are being put in that situation where those potential things can happen because you have oligarchs over in Russia who are willing to pay athletes millions of dollars. Where here in the United States, Brittany Griner would make, $150,000, something like that. So, I think, and beginning next year, the WNBA is going to adopt new rules in which players who do play overseas, if they don't come to camp in the United States, or if they don't report to their teams by I forget the specific day, but it's basically this time, the beginning of May, that they'll be suspended for the whole season and can't play that season.
Wow. So
now you have a player like Michaela McBride who her option is, okay, do I play overseas and make, maybe 10 times what I'm making in the United States? Or do I play in the United States because if I don't, I can't play for the rest of the summer.
Yeah.
The league is really unfortunately kind of putting players kind of in tough situations there.
Right. Lucas Seehafer is joining us here on Whatever Flips Your Waffle this week here on 365sportscast.com. We're running the gamut. We've talked about a lot of injury things, and as a physical therapist, Lucas has some good insight on that. Just a little preview here of the Minnesota Lynx, and we're going to finish up this week talking about the Minnesota Twins, the first place Minnesota Twins. Would anybody have predicted that before the season started?
First place, maybe not.
No.
I thought they were going to be better than most people thought they were, but first place, I thought the White Sox were going to have that in the bag. But speaking of injuries, you can't have there's not many more teams in the league more banged up than they are right now.
They're just, is this the Minnesota sports curse? They just seem snake bit when you list off, when you make the list of players who have been or are still hurt. Buxton spent some time, as you talked about, Sonny Gray, who looks like he's going to come back here pretty soon, Bailey Ober, Miguel Sano might be out till at least midseason, Alex Kirilloff, now Correa out for an undetermined time as they figure out how long his finger is going to take to heal. And mix in with that, all of a sudden COVID is rearing its head again. And what can a team do?
Yeah, it's that's part of the reason why to start the year the MLB allowed teams to carry 28 people on their roster because they figured something like that might happen. Is also why they have the 40-man roster where they can kind of call up and send down minor league players as needed, as long as they're on that 40-man roster. part of that is just really bad luck, and part of that is, hey, that's what happens in baseball.
Yes,
People get injured all the time, and it's the next man up mentality. I think for the most part, the people that have come up and in place of some of these injured players have done really well. You look at the Josh Winders, Yoan Durans, even like your Trevor Larnach, who was called up kind of begrudgingly because they didn't really have any other options. Now he's ripping the cover off the ball while Alex Kirilloff is still trying to get things figured out down at AAA. So I think for as many injuries as they've suffered, I don't think you can complain too much about people that have come up and kind of replace some of those players. We'll see how Royce Lewis does now that he's gonna get the call to replace Correa.
Yeah, that's exciting. He's been just doing so well in the minor leagues, and everybody wants to see him, and you hope that he can kind of fulfill those expectations. And it's a good problem to have, I guess. We've seen in past years where they're calling these guys up, last year especially out of necessity, and they just weren't quite ready for it. Bailey Ober did okay last year, maybe wasn't quite ready. The experience might have helped him. Joel Ryan's experience certainly did. He's been playing well. But Kirilloff is the one that really concerns me. This recurring injury or problems with his wrist. Are you at all concerned? And again, you know a little bit more about this or have a little more insight from your education. Could this be something we really have to worry about, that it's going to keep happening?
Yeah, so it's kind of tough to say because I don't think it's ever been formally announced kind of like what exactly he's dealing with. As it pertains to the wrist, there's a couple different things that could be going on. And if you consider each of them kind of as an isolated event, they're usually not too big of a deal. But what maybe is a little concerning is that Kirilloff had this last summer, tried to play through it, didn't go so well, so then he elected to have surgery, and then had a setback that was never really elaborated on, I think in like November or December. And then did okay during spring training, and then it popped up again. He recently got a cortisone shot to try and calm things down, and now he's rehabbing. I think it's tough to say kind of what the prognosis is looking forward, just because we don't have a ton of information specifically on what he's dealing with. But I think what you can start to look at is, when Kirilloff was really succeeding in the minor leagues, he was getting on base, he was hitting for a fairly high average, he was hitting the ball hard, having lots of doubles and home runs, that kind of stuff. Was able to play a capable left field and a pretty solid first base. And ever since he first kind of injured his wrist, his power has really kind of zapped. He's maybe still hitting for a decent average, but they're mostly singles. He doesn't have a ton of extra base hits, or if they are like a double, it's not a double that was, if there was a warmer day out or if the wind was going a different direction, it'd be a home run. They're kind of, the pulls the liner to the corner or shoots it the other way, that kind of stuff. So I think I'm optimistic that in the long run it'll be okay. Sometimes these things just take a little while to work themselves out. And as much as we'd like it to be the case, very rarely is rehab kind of a linear progression in which things just keep getting better and better and better. But I think at this point it's kind of up in the air. We need to. I've kind of caught some of his games in St. Paul as he's been rehabbing on his rehab assignment. And he's swinging. It looks like he's swinging hard. Doesn't seem to be really, taking anything off his swing. There hasn't been any reports that he's still feeling soreness, or that the Saints are going to, shut him down or anything like that. But that power, that lift, still just hasn't manifested. So that'll definitely be something to monitor, not only while he's in AAA, but once he does eventually make it back to the Twins. Right.
I think most Twins fans anticipate that he is our next first baseman, our next regular, that Sanoa's probably not going to be around next year. We've been filling in. I mean, all of a sudden you see Luis Arraez playing first base, and he's done, an admirable job over there. But we need a long-term solution, and that's the hope, I think, is that he is it.
Mm-hmm. Him, or you even look at someone like a Jose Miranda, who can play third base, second base, first base. Kirilloff can obviously play right field, left field, first base. I think the Twins, if you were to give him truth serum and say, hey, what's the best case scenario? What do we want to have happen here? It would be Kirilloff playing first base for the next 10 years for the Minnesota Twins, just because he's kind of got the most field for the position. He's left-handed, so he can only play, so many positions to begin with. But if for whatever reason he isn't able to stick at first base, Jose Miranda can do a decent job there. You even look at a kind of a lesser-known name in the minor leagues, Jermaine Palacios, who's primarily a shortstop, but he's also played third base, second base. He's played pretty much every position except for center field and catcher. So he could maybe slide in there every now and then too. So the Twins do have options, but they definitely want Kirilloff as kind of the main guy moving forward.
Absolutely. But it's a lot of positivity around the Twins these days. It's exciting. Hopefully they can kind of keep that rolling. And as we've talked about, May is a month where they can win a lot of ball games, I think, and hopefully keep that roll going. Keep people interested. We like to have things to be interested in. The Lynx firing up their season, the Twins in first place. It's really a fun time to be a Minnesota sports fan as the sun starts to shine once again. Lucas, thank you so much for joining us this week. Lucas Seehafer, check him out. Some writing on Twins Daily and at the Next. And you can find him on Twitter and follow along with some of that material he does. Fascinating stuff here. Lucas, thank you for talking about injuries and the Lynx and the Twins.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. We'll have to do this again sometime. It was fun.
Absolutely. We'll be right back. Normally, you might hear an advertisement here. I'd like to take a moment this week, however, to give a huge shout out to my wife, Michelle. All the things she does to support Whatever Flips Your Waffle. Anytime I do something kind of offbeat like this, she's always there and backs me up on these kind of things. And certainly, I am very grateful for that and want to say thank you to my wife, Michelle. I love you and appreciate all the support you give me. And now it's time for the state of Minnesota sports. As you just heard, talking with Lucas, we touched on a lot of things, but especially the Lynx. He's got a real passion for the Minnesota Lynx and knows a whole lot more about them than I do. And so it was really interesting to talk about the injuries they have and how they have to do their roster formation and how that kind of limits them a little bit. And in their first two games this season, you saw that. And Coach Cheryl Reeve even said, it's really difficult waiting for somebody to come back over from Europe, and you have these injuries, and you have to make these decisions, and you just haven't played together enough and don't have all the resources to put you where you want to be. And by all indications, the Lynx should be fine by the end of the season. But, last year they started 0-4 and didn't look great. And they've started 0-2, and as you're listening to this, possibly 0-3. We're recording on Tuesday, and the Lynx are playing this evening. But it's a little distressing when you have that team that you kind of expect year in and year out to do well. And they've been in both ball games. First game of the season, they just got blown out of the water in the second half. And the second game of the season, the same kind of thing. You have this lull offensively, and you're unable to do anything. I think they tied for the least amount of points in a quarter in franchise history during their second game of the season. And again, we expect that the ship will be righted. Hopefully it has been a little bit as you listen to this on Wednesday, that they're 1-2 instead of 0-3. One never knows, but a team that we hang a lot of hopes on in this state to do something. And like Lucas said, they have a chance to compete, but they're probably more like the bottom part of the playoff picture. But, you put some things together and you make a run, and you never know what's going to happen in the world of sports. That's why they play the games. The Wild are sitting here and, again, playing Game 5, the crucial Game 5, as this is being put together. And it's just been a weird series, this, blowing each other out, each going 1-1 on their home ice between the Wild and the Blues. And I already saw speculation partway through Game 4 that if the Wild win, come on, Minnesota fans, don't put stuff like that down, because you know what's going to happen just as well as I do. When you say things like that, things will go haywire, it'll go sideways, and indeed it did for the Wild in Game 4. So here we're at a best-of-3 series, essentially, and I would bet dollars to donuts this will be a 7-game series by the time it's all said and done. I think the Wild will win at home. I think they'll lose in St. Louis in Game 6, and then it's anybody's guess in Game 7. And whether next week we'll be talking about the Wild in Round 2 or not will remain to be seen. A lot's going to have to do with goaltending really stepping up and making up for some of the deficiencies caused by penalties and turnovers and things like that that the Wild just can't continue to do if they want to be a good, quality, Stanley Cup hopeful style team. Some Vikings news this week. A couple weeks ago, we had Troy Ramage on here talking about the draft. And they've signed a number of undrafted free agents. They've reached their roster limit of 90 that they can have on the team. Picked up some interesting names. Nobody that would stand out to you, but for instance, signing another punter, which is not an area I thought we had a whole lot of concern in last year. Special teams really was exceptional overall, especially compared to recent years in Vikings history. But you know what? It never hurts to have a little bit of competition when it comes to training camp. It makes everybody a little bit better instead of just saying, hey, it's your job. Unless you're such an established, great player at your position, and we're talking about punters, you think about Ray Guy from the Oakland Raiders way back in the day. Greg Coleman probably didn't have a whole lot to worry about after he'd been established here in Minnesota for a little bit of time. But otherwise, hey, bring somebody in. It doesn't hurt. You want to fill out this roster a little bit anyway and have those sort of competitions. And again, you never know. These guys can surprise you, not just the punter, of course, but other positions. And you never know when the next Adam Thielen's going to show up on your doorstep. And if you develop that player correctly, could really have an impact on the team for years to come. The schedule for next year is kind of coming out, and the Vikings have some interesting games there as well. They will open at home against the New York Giants, and you have to think, boy, if we want to get off to a good start, the New York Giants would probably be a good place to do that. They did not have a great year last year. I'm sure they'll be improved. They're going to make some progress, but you start off with them at home, automatically you say a game the Vikings should win. Week 2, they play Philadelphia on Monday Night Football, so that'll be a big matchup right away as well. And so you're going to knock down a couple NFC East teams right away and play some of those. The Vikings will also play overseas this year, and I believe that's Week 4 against New Orleans. And, the best part about that is that that was going to be a home game for the Saints. And you think about the house of horrors that the Superdome has been for the Vikings over the years. And, of course, we all remember the 2009 NFC Championship game especially. But I'll take that game over there. The Vikings still get 9 home games this year. With that 17, all the teams that lose a home game because of traveling over to Europe are ones that had 9 home games to begin with. But I'm sure that the NFL looked at that and said, here could be a marquee matchup, and we're going to put them over there and play. So that'll be a early Sunday morning at 8:30, I believe 8:30 our time, Sunday morning football game, which means you could have a whole lot of football to watch on that day. Start with that game, go with the noon game, the 3:30 game, Sunday night football. A lot of things could go on. If you are really a diehard football fan, you'll have a lot of football to watch that day. But, the Vikings, as I've said, and I'll continue to say, I think should be a playoff team this year if things kind of break their way and avoiding some critical injuries, that sort of a thing. But a lot of time between now and then, and we'll certainly speculate plenty before we get there. Let's finish up with the Minnesota Twins. Last week, we talked about them playing 4 in Baltimore, 3 at home against Oakland, and I had suggested you should be able to take 3 out of 4 from Baltimore and at least 2 out of 3, if not sweep the Oakland Athletics. And the Twins came close. A little disappointing that they split in Baltimore. Again, the Orioles, not a great team, but the Twins just sort of fell apart at the wrong times. The game losing 5-3, giving up 5 solo home runs. That's not something you expect this year. This year especially, with the ball being a little bit more dead than it has been in the past. But then coming home and sweeping the Oakland A's, 3 one-run ball games. And certainly Twins fans on the edge of their seats. If you scroll through Twitter and you see things like the Emilio Pagan experience is not one I want to keep doing. Boy, he's got shades of Ron Davis in him, the old Vikings closer from the early to mid 80s. And every single time, and he doesn't seem to have the control that he's been known for in the past. Hopefully that can get resolved, but Duran as well came in for a 2-inning save and just continues to break records on the miles per hour on his pitches, 102 and 103 miles an hour. How are you going to hit that? How are you going to hit the splitter that comes at 95? That's unbelievable. You just got to keep control. He got in a little bit of trouble in the 9th inning against the A's the other day, walked a guy, hit a guy, but then kind of settled in and took care of business. This is an interesting Twins team, despite injuries, despite all that. They're finding ways to win. And again, what they're doing this year is they're beating teams that are not very good. And now they have to turn around. And again, as you're listening to this, it's Game 2 against the Houston Astros. Really the only team the rest of the month of May that they play that has an over 500 record. And the Astros are good. And we'll see if Correa is able to come back. Certainly a scare with the potential breaking of his finger. I'm glad that didn't happen, but he still is a little unsure about when he's coming back. Possibly, again, as you're listening, he might be in the ball game. He was saying for sure he probably wasn't going to play Tuesday. Buxton dinged up again. Larnach put on the disabled list. The Twins are running out of – they just don't have any position players left on their 40-man roster. If more people continue to get hurt, they're going to have to really do some creative shuffling if they're going to figure things out. But as these guys come back, I saw one take online where they said no matter what, Royce Lewis has already shown that he deserves to stay in the majors. And a lot of that is his defense. He stepped right in and made some plays defensively at shortstop in place of Correa. We've seen Jose Miranda come in and do some things at times, hit the ball hard, going opposite field. And so this young talent, again, this is the key. You're going to have injuries. You're going to have people dinged up. And can you bring these young guys up and make something happen? Last year was not the case. Last year, anytime they brought somebody up, it was just seemed like a dumpster fire about every time. This year, good things are happening. This is a major league team, too, that when you look at their pitching, and despite all the different things, the pitching staff going into Tuesday's game owned the 4th best ERA in baseball at 3.11. That's incredible. And somehow they're piecing this thing together. Sonny Gray comes back, pitches really well, but he's going to have to build back up. You knew he wasn't going to be able to go for very long. But then Paddock comes in and he gets hurt. Some inflammation, some strain in his elbow. That's never a good sign. And it's nice, with Jace Tingler acting in place of Rocco Baldelli, that he's got experience with Paddock and he understands some of the things that he's been through in the past. And so hopefully everybody's going to get back soon. Baldelli and Arise and Bundy dealing with COVID and stuff like that. But the Twins are fun to watch these days, and we'll hope again that they can continue this really nice run at the top of the American League Central. And that's the state of Minnesota sports. And now it's time for This Week in Minnesota Sports History. On May 11th in 1858, that's a long time ago, Minnesota officially became a state, and because of that, we have Minnesota sports. On May 11th in 1982, the Twins received Tom Brunansky from the Angels in a trade for Doug Corbett and Rob Wilfong. Brunansky, of course, would go on to play a crucial role in the 1987 World Series Championship. On May 12th in 1982, the Twins traded Butch Winnegar and Roger Erickson to the Yankees for some rather unforgettable names. So on back-to-back days, some trades for the Twins in 1982, and the Griffiths were accused of being rather frugal at the time. Of course, it all worked out in the end for the Twins. On May 13th in 1989, the Twins' Kirby Puckett hit 4 doubles in one game in a 10-8 win over Toronto. He would go on the next day to hit 2 more doubles, 6 consecutive at-bats with a double. Pretty impressive for Kirby. On May 13th in 2011, Harmon Killebrew entered hospice care as he dealt with cancer. And later on May 17th that same year, just 4 days later, Harmon Killebrew, one of the greatest Twins ever, passed away. On May 14th in 2018, former Twins manager Frank Quillisi died. He managed the Twins in the early 70s and had right around a 500 record. On May 15th in 1991, Paul Molitor of the Brewers at the time hit for the cycle in a win against the Twins at the Metrodome. Molitor, of course, from Minnesota, would come to play for the Twins later that decade and then manage the Twins not too long ago. On May 16th in 1984, the Twins sold over 51,000 tickets for a game, but just over 6,000 people showed up. Harvey McKay had bought a bunch to help meet a clause in the Metrodome lease where if the Twins didn't sell enough tickets that year, they could break their lease and move. So even as far back as 1984, owners were looking to possibly move the Twins out of Minnesota. Here they had this big new stadium, and they still weren't happy with it. On May 16th in 2003, the Anaheim Ducks completed a 4-0 sweep of the Minnesota Wild in the Western Conference Finals of the NHL. Of course, the Wild had early success in their careers here in Minnesota, and it was an exciting run that year. On May 16th in 2014, the Twins beat the Mariners 5-4 at Target Field, notching win number 4,224 since they moved to Minnesota back in 1961, which was one more than the franchise won in all its years as the Washington Senators. On May 17th, 1963, Bob Allison became the first Twin to hit 3 home runs in one game in an 11-4 win in Cleveland. May 17th, 1998, David Wells of the Yankees threw a perfect game against the Twins, winning 4-0. I remember sitting on my couch watching that game on Sunday afternoon, as I recall, and later on David Wells would talk about the hangover that he had from the night before, possibly still a little bit inebriated. For our local listeners, this week in Richland, Heartland, Ellendale, Geneva sports, May 12th, golf is at Blue Earth, softball is home versus Medford, and baseball is at Medford. May 13th, girls golf is at Janesville, softball is at home against Triton and Blooming Prairie. It's make-up time here. We got to get some games in. Baseball is at home against Alden Conquer. Plus, we have our Thespians putting on a play at the school, 7 o'clock on Friday evening. Sunday, the 15th at 2:30. It's a comedy, deals with the Brothers Grimm and all those fairy tales. So come on out to the school and enjoy that as well. May 14th is the conference track meet at Triton over in Dodge Center. And May 16th, golf at Waseca. Softball is at home versus USC, and baseball is at United South Central in Wells. As always, all of those are subject to change based on the weather, which finally seems to be turning around a little bit. Well, that's going to do it. Another helping of waffles is complete here at 365sportscast.com. I'm glad you joined us this week. Hope you'll continue to tune in each and every week right here at 8 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock Central. Remember, if you can't catch the original broadcast, jot it down each week's episode. Replays Thursday at 10, Friday at 7, Saturday at 10, Monday at 8, and Tuesday at 10, all Eastern Standard Time. You can also head over to YouTube, search up whatever flips your waffle, and you can view any of our past shows. Remember, if you have some comments, if you have a possibility of being a good interview for the show, email me, waffleflipper22@gmail.com, or message me on Twitter at Mr. D1973. Next week, right back into Minnesota sports. Will the Twins continue their good play atop the American League Central? Will the Wild be eyeing the second round of the NHL playoffs, or will they be eyeing the off-season? And how will the Lynx continue to do? I'll have another special guest to delve into all that and more. Thanks for joining me. This is Mark Domeyer, signing off with Syrup.